Hello and welcome to Tabletop Lighting, controlling highlight and shadow quality. This is probably the most fun section of this entire series because it's probably the most fun you can have with a camera and a tabletop. Okay, let's get started. The first thing we're going to learn about is controlling shadow detail. Let's look at this cube right here. Let's just say that there's a hard light source coming in from the top right hand corner and it's affecting it and making that shadow, that hard shadow on the left hand side of the frame. Now by hard shadow I mean that it has sharp lines and it has a very definite form, unlike this one for instance, which is a very diffuse shadow, very soft and has soft lines instead of the hard ones as in the first one. Now let's go back to the one lit by the hard light again with a hard shadow. Notice that it has a side right there that is the lightest side. It's lightest because it's closest to the light source and it's acting as a big highlight, a very big soft highlight across that entire face. Then we have the top one. That is the second lightest side, mainly because it's facing away from the light and therefore it's not getting as much light as the right side. Then we have the third side, which is the darkest side. It's the side facing furthest away from the light source and therefore it's getting the least amount of light, thus the darkest side. This shading quality, the difference between the lightest side, the medium side, and the darkest side, and also that shadow that's behind it, is what makes this cube look three-dimensional. And it's important to do that considering that we're shooting with a device that only has one eye and therefore doesn't see three dimensions like human beings with both of our eyes that allow us to perceive in 3D. Essentially, the camera sees everything as flat, and the only way to make something pop out of the frame and kind of feel like it's three-dimensional is by using lighting. And the shading, the actual shadow that the object creates on the surface, is just as important as the actual light that falls on the subject to create that illusion of three-dimensionality. Now we can control that shadow quality by adding diffusion to the light source, by changing the shape of the light source, by making it larger. The larger the light source, the softer the shadow. So we just made this into a broad, large light source instead of that tiny one that was there before. And the shadow became a lot softer because the light source itself is wrapping around the object and surrounding it with light, and therefore the shadow just keeps getting softer and softer. The more you can see us moving that piece of diffusion on the right side closer to the object, the more it's going to change its character. When we go back to the hard lighting, you can see that it's a major difference. Now we're going to drop another object into that frame, so you can see something totally different. This little wooden airplane is made out of the same material as the wood block, so what's going to happen is it's going to absorb light in the exact same way. But it has a much more complex shape than the woodblock. Now we're going to turn it away from the light so we can get better modeling on it. We're going to add a little white card on the left side so that we can get the same contrast ratio as the woodblock from light to dark. Now the red propeller feels like it's getting the same amount of light as the darkest side of the woodblock. Now we can start looking at the shadow quality. You'll notice that it has a hard shadow, which means it has very sharp edges. But when we add diffusion, watch what happens to the shadow. It becomes a lot softer, just like when we diffuse the light for the cube. So even though the airplane has a much more complex shape than the cube, adding diffusion to the light is going to have the exact same result. It's going to wrap the light around the airplane and make a very soft shadow on the other side. Now notice the darkness of the shadows on the airplane, especially that one right there underneath the wing, and also the one in the tail. Now the interplay between those shadows right there and also the highlight that's right there on the airplane makes this image feel like it has good contrast. The one thing that good contrast does in an image like this, especially for tabletop though, is that it takes the attention away from the texture of the wood itself. Let's see what happens when we drop in this diffusion, and we're going to go ahead and brighten up the scene a little bit. Notice how the shadows underneath the wing and underneath the tail have become a lot softer, and therefore they're not drawing attention away from the texture of the airplane itself, which is the wood. Watch what happens again when we go to a high contrast lighting situation. The shadows are drawing attention away from the texture. Now that we've learned what light does for these wooden objects that absorb highlights and absorb light, let's see what it does for chrome objects, which are a lot harder to light. This is an old Zenith Space Command remote control for an old television. Notice how dirty it is. It's got dirt everywhere. You can see it on the HD signal very well, so we have to go ahead and clean the remote control before we use it for the first time. Another thing we're going to notice is that when we set it down on its side, watch that very, very bright highlight right there on the left side. That's called a specular highlight, and that was virtually non-existent when we had our wooden model before. The reason being is that the wooden model didn't have any shiny surfaces on it that would reflect the light directly back into the camera, so it had no major specular highlights. And because of that, if we didn't mind sacrificing the texture of the airplane, we could still use a hard light source on it and not have this bright specular highlight reflecting the light source directly back into our eyes. So after we gave the remote control a thorough cleaning, we put it right back in the same light as we had it in before. Notice the shadow quality right there on the left side. It's exactly the same as when we had the cube and also the airplane. It's a very hard shadow. So when we drop some diffusion in front of the light source, we're going to make the light source bigger. It's going to wrap around the remote control, and therefore the shadows are going to get softer. It also gives the remote control a little bit more elegance and stature, sort of like adding a soft drop shadow to a screen font. Also notice this nice soft highlight that's created along the edge of the remote control. These kinds of highlight help reveal the texture of the remote control and make it feel even more chrome and silver. Now we're going to add a white card on the left hand side of the frame so that we can fill in that shadow a little bit, make it less dark. Now remember, we haven't added any new lights. This is just a white card reflecting the main key light. Another thing we're going to look at is this unflattering reflection of something along the entire body of the remote control. It's unflattering. It's taking attention away from that chrome nature of the remote control. So we aim to actually take it out. The best way to do that is to bring in a white card behind the remote control on these metal feet. Later on we're going to show you exactly how we did everything on a big wide shot, but right now we're just going to concentrate on the object itself. Notice how that highlight keeps getting manipulated back and forth, and we're finding just the right slash across. We've almost removed all trace of that unflattering reflection on the side of the remote control. You can see that it's now alternating between black, silver, and that highlight that we created also revealed a speck on the back of the remote control. Again, when you're doing HD on tabletop projects, it's better to have a very nice large monitor so you can see exactly what you're doing, which is how we noticed it. So we went ahead and cleaned it off, we changed the aspect a little bit, and now we're using white cotton gloves so that we don't leave any fingerprints on the chrome side. Our next objective is to break up that silver facet along the entire front of the remote control. So we're going to add a black card on the front of the remote, and we're going to try to position it in just the right way to make a slash across the front of it. That's going to keep that black silver alternating feel to it, and once again give it one more aspect that's very unique. So we decided to elevate the black card off the surface of the counter by using those metal feet with the alligator clips to lift the card off the counter. We're going to keep working with it until we find just the right slash across the remote control. Now don't forget, we're still cutting and shaping the key light. We haven't added any lights yet. The cards are acting like miniature flags and reflectors, allowing us to shape the key light. We just cut them out of a large piece of cardstock that's black on one side and white on the other side. Now we're going to go ahead and start adding some lighting. This is just a small $2 LED light, and we're using it to bounce off of the white card that's sitting behind the remote control so that it will color that highlight that's along the black side of the remote and make it blue. Now we're going to add one more light. It's a blue LED glow stick that we bought from a store. It's about $3. We're going to take it and we're going to put it on the right side of the frame so that it creates one more reflection in the silver facet of the remote control. If we're careful, we can keep it just out of frame, and we can sculpt a nice new highlight across the entire face. Let's see what we've created now. We've created a blue soft highlight, a silver, a black, another white, a black, and a blue highlight. Now we've done that with the use of just our key light, a couple of LED lights, and a couple of black and white cards. We've enhanced the appearance of the remote control and made it look a little bit more modern. This is in stark contrast to where we started off with just one hard light source and no reflectors. Notice how drab and lifeless this image now seems compared to our new one. Now let's not rest on our laurels, let's see what else we can do. We're going to bring in an LED flashlight on the top right hand side of the frame to try to manipulate the background. This is going to help separate the remote control from the background by making the background more blue and also more bright. We thought it would look even more futuristic if you could actually see the striations in the lens of the flashlight. It also breaks up the background and makes it even more interesting. So now that we've added some color effects lights and a background light, it's time to add a rim light. We're going to use another flashlight that's sitting in a flashlight holder with legs that allow us to position it anywhere we like. Now you're going to see how this rim light from the top right hand side of the frame is going to bring up the logo and make it even more bright. This is going to draw more attention to it so that the first thing that you see when you look at this frame is the Zenith logo. We also found out that if we lower the light a little bit, we can get a very nice reflection off the bottom right hand side of the remote control. This gives it even more futuristic elegance. Now we also decided that we're going to bring in another rim light from the top left hand side of the frame to highlight the grill work along the front of the remote control. But we also wanted to use a different color at this time. From the first moment I saw this particular remote control, it reminded me of an old phaser from Star Trek. So I wanted to make it feel like it's emitting some kind of red light from the front. So I used a 1-watt LED flashlight with a magenta gel on it to create that kind of a look. However, I noticed that the white area in the front of the frame on the bottom left hand side was just drawing too much attention to itself and not enough attention to the logo on the back. So I introduced a black card on the left side of the key light, which is the right side of the frame, to cut some of that light off of the left hand side of the frame. So now let's look at it before and after. This is before the flag. You notice how there's a lot of light on the left hand side of the frame, and that area of white is getting a lot of attention. But after we put in the flag, it draws more attention to the manufacturer's mark and less to the white area on the front left hand side of the frame. So now it's time to add a red light to the front of the remote control to make it look even more like a phaser. We're going to add the xenon flashlight with a red gel on the front. Notice when we look at the spot that it makes that it just doesn't have enough saturation in it. The best way to counter that is to double up on the gel. So we're going to add one more layer of gel, and this is the result that we get. So now we've reached the right saturation, but it's too bright. The reason that it's too bright is because there's too much overall light hitting the object. The easiest way to fix that is to either dim the light source down or use a larger flag. We don't want to dim the light source down because we like what it's doing to the rest of the object. What we want to do is just use a larger flag when we darken a specific area and allow color to show more. So now let's see what happens when we bring in that flashlight. Notice how much more saturated it is. However, it's still a little bit too spotty. It's very red, but it's a little bit too spotty. And the surefire cure for that is to add some diffusion. So we're going to take the flashlight out, put some diffusion on the flashlight directly, and bring it right back in. Now that we've added some diffusion, it doesn't feel like it's challenging the back of the remote for attention. It just feels like there's a red light being emitted from that flashlight, and it looks great. Now it's time to take a look at the wide shot and see exactly what we just did. As you can see, the parts that we used are extremely affordable pieces of equipment. We just used basic black cardstock, we used flashlights, LED lights, and that's pretty much it. There's really nothing much more to it. In fact, everything that you see in front of you, including the lights and the LED lights, cost less than $100. So let's start taking away some lights and see what we did. Let's take away the red light first. This is the one that was creating the illusion of the light coming from the phaser. Now we're going to turn off the blue light that was reflecting into the black side of the remote control. And there it goes. You can see how it was reflecting into that white card directly behind it. Now we're going to take away the background light, which was making those striations on the background. Now we're going to turn off the logo light, which was the rim light coming in from the back right hand side. You can see the spot right there as we show you the light and where its position is. You can also see that there are so many other positions you could have had it at that would create whole different kinds of looks. Now we're going to turn off the red rim light from the back left hand side that was making the red pattern on the grill. There goes the blue glow stick that we're using to make a line across the silver face, the large flag that was used to block the light from the front of the frame, and also the black card that was used to make a line across the silver face. And that's pretty much it. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next project. In this particular project, we're going to use a colored background, which is this blue cardstock. However, we found out that we don't like the angle that we were at before. It was too much of a high angle and we didn't see the front of the robot. So we went to a lower angle, and we're zooming in right there to get a focus. We found out that the camera's too close to the object. So we're going to pull the camera back and get a focus, and then pull the blue cardstock up behind the robot so it'll work like a seamless background. Next, we're going to bring in a fill light on the left-hand side of the frame to fill in the front of the robot. It's just a $6 globe light that we bought from the store and put in a bulb into it, and then we covered it up with some Duvetine so that it doesn't reflect back into the camera. You can see it coming in right there, and then we're going to pull the camera back here in just a second and actually show you exactly what it looks like. Now we're bringing in a piece of cardstock on the right hand side of the frame to block some of the key light off the background. This is very important in most of these tabletop endeavors because the object is usually so close to the background. Let's see it up close and see what happens. We're going to take away the cardstock right here. Now the background is getting the same amount of exposure as the robot, so it doesn't feel right. But if we bring in the card, it acts like a big flag and it flags the light off the background. It separates the robot from the background. Just because the robot and the background are two different colors doesn't mean they're properly isolated from each other. You have to give the background a different exposure, either higher or lower, so that it properly isolates from the foreground object. Now let's see if we can sculpt the key a little bit and take some light off the robot's legs and leave it more on its head. And there it is. Let's see how we did that. We used a piece of cardstock mounted on those two metal feet, and we're going to swing it in and out so you can see exactly what it's doing. We're using it to shield the bottom part of the key off the robot. Next, we thought it'd be kind of neat if we can get a rim light on the back of the robot's legs instead. And there it is on the close-up. You can see how it's illuminating that normally dark part of its leg. Next, we wanted to add a red light on the front of the robot. So we used a xenon flashlight with a red gel on it, and we illuminated the right side of the robot and separated it from the other side. You could add other LED lights around it, actual prop lights in the frame or practicals, to create the motivation for that light if you wanted to. Next thing we wanted to do is to color the fill light a little bit so that it's not just pure white. And we're adding a little bit of a greenish blue tinted gel so that it doesn't feel like the fill light is the exact same hue as the key light. We wanted to separate them, make them feel like two whole different entities. Now we're going to add a background light. It's the same flashlight we were using the last time to add as a rim light on the last object. It has a very definite pattern, and so we're using it to actually shape the background. So first we flag the light off the background from the key light, then we reverse the direction of the key light for the background light. This creates a much more interesting frame. Now we're adding a little flag on the left hand side, primarily to flag the light coming from the fill light off the background. So we don't want any light spilling from the fill light onto the background. We want the background to be even more high contrast and to be only lit by the background light itself, which is that new spot that we introduced. Now we're adding a miniature flag on the left hand side. Once again, this is being used to flag some of that fill light off the legs of the robot. There's really no particular reason why we're doing it, it's just a creative reason, we just thought it would look better. Now we're adding a small LED on the bottom left hand side of the frame to try to make a gradient on the head of the robot, right there. Next, we're going to try to add another rim light on the left hand side to also highlight the robot's left leg. It seems like it's kind of counterintuitive. Why would we flag some of the fill light off and then add another rim light to do exactly what the fill light was doing? Because it's a whole different direction. It's creating a line of highlight along the entire leg that's a lot more interesting than what the fill light was doing. It's also creating another highlight on the head of the robot that makes it look like he has eyes now. Okay, so that does it for this object. Let's see what would happen if we take this object right out of the frame as it is and dropped in a metallic one instead, like this camera right here. Notice that the magnesium coating on that camera makes it so that it's not reflecting light in a very specular manner, like the remote control did because it was mostly chrome. The only reflective surface on that camera is that chrome ring on the front. And because we're using a very soft key, it's actually not very distracting. It's not too bad actually. If the intention was to light the camera, this is not how I would do it. However, it is actually working pretty well considering. The metal skin of that camera is absorbing more light than the plastic of the robot was. So it just needed a small bump in exposure, but that's about it. So let's go ahead and tear it down and see what it would look like if we hadn't used any of our lights, and see if it was just a key, what would this image look like. There goes the red light, there goes the LED that was making the blue light on it, there goes the background light, and there goes the rim light, there goes the other rim light, there goes the fill. We're taking away the cards. Now it's just being lit by the key light. So there you go. That would be the image without any lighting if you had just put the camera on a table and put a light on it. Now let's watch it in reverse order and make sure we know exactly what we did. Now the last three setups are pretty interesting if you're into futuristic type things. But what if you're not? What if you want to know how to light something more classic? Let's just say a Super 8mm camera and its splicer. This is what it would look like if you put a light directly above the camera, like a lot of people do, and just try to take a photograph of it this way, or try to shoot some video of it that way, maybe do some pans and tilts on it. Doesn't look very interesting, but if you take the light off to the left hand side, it starts to get some character. Mainly because we're starting to get a shadow off to the right hand side of the frame, we're starting to get a little bit of character, the camera's starting to feel like it's three-dimensional. But let's just say we decided to use a soft fluorescent light instead of that hard light that we had on the left hand side. At first it doesn't look very good, but when we iris down and we do some things, it's going to look really nice. There we are irising down, so we're bringing it down to exposure, and we're bringing in a fill light on the right hand side so we can actually read the lettering on it. Now we're going to bring in a cardstock on the left hand side of the frame to block some light off the background, just like we learned in the last section. After a little bit of manipulation, we can get that flag to block just enough light off the background that it will have separate exposure from the camera itself. So there's the set as we have it right now. The next thing we're going to try to do is bring in a flag on the right hand side of the frame to block some of the fill light off of that metal dial. It darkens the right side of the camera, and it also breaks up that metal dial and makes it more interesting. Darkening the edge of your frame is always going to draw more attention to the center where it ought to be. Now we're going to bring in a reflective card in the center of the frame, as you can see it right there, to bring up the front element of the camera. Watch it lightening the shadows at the front of the camera as we swing it in and out. As I said before, darkening the edges of the frame is going to draw more attention to the center, so we're going to darken the bottom left hand side with a small flag. As you're doing your lighting, make sure you keep checking back with your monitor. That way you can make sure that the magnitude of the effect isn't too great. Next thing we're going to do is try to color the frame a little bit. We're going to try to put in this full CTO, color temperature orange gel, and color the key a little bit to see what would happen. We're going to try to color a portion of the light or the entire light. And I personally don't like that effect, so I switched it over to the fill light to see what would happen then. I personally like that effect a lot better. It was a little bit more subtle. It only colored a part of the frame and not the entire frame as if it were the key light. Next I brought in a xenon flashlight with a CTO gel on it because I wanted to bring up the texture of the camera on the right hand side of the frame. And it worked very well as a rim light because it brought up that fine texture that's on the camera so it feels like you can almost touch it. Next I brought in another flashlight on the left hand side of the frame with double CTO on it. And the reason I used double CTO is because it was an LED light, so it's more blue and it requires more CTO to get that orange look. The purpose of that LED light was to bring up that dark area in front of the splicer. So now the image is complete. Now the setup is ready for us to do pans, tilts, zooms, whatever we like to present this product. Now that we're done with our tabletop setups, I wanted to take a couple of minutes and actually show you some of the instruments that we use to arrive at the final frames. The first thing I want to show you is the fluorescent bulbs. The one on the top right hand side is about $1.50 a piece, the one on the bottom left hand side is about $2 a piece. They're both made by Conserve Energy. If you buy them in bulk, if you buy 4 of them at a time instead of just one at a time, you're literally only paying $2 a piece for them. The one on the top right hand side is only 13 watts, but it puts out the equivalent of 40 watts. The one on the bottom left hand side is 23 watts, puts out the equivalent of 80 watts. Here we irised our camera down to about f11 and used 2 levels of ND so we can show you exactly what the bulb looks like at full flame. They do have a slight greenish color cast, but that's easily corrected either by white balancing to them or by using an 8th magenta color correction gel. The effort is worthwhile because they emit almost no heat. That's why I can safely handle them with my bare hands even when they're on. You can see how the 13 watt model emits a lot less light at the exact same exposure than the 23 watt model. It has a slight flicker to it until it warms up and gets a temperature. Here are the bulbs next to some other more conventional bulbs. The one on the top left hand side is the soft diffused bulb, it's about 40 watts, and the one on the bottom right hand side is the bare bulb that we used in the card table scene. Here's the 40 watt standard bulb at full intensity at the exact same exposure as we used for the 23 watt and the 13 watt fluorescent bulbs. Here's the 23 watt bulb. You can see that it emits a lot more light while using about half the energy of the 40 watt standard bulb. So it emits twice as much light, uses half the energy. That's why it's really nice to be able to use these all day long in a tabletop setup, especially when filming food or other things that can melt under heat. Now here's the 40 watt bare bulb that just has a thin filament on the inside and it doesn't have that diffused glass that makes the filament larger in size. That's why the light from this is very sharp and the shadows that are generated on the objects are extremely hard shadows. This is the same bulb, of course, that we used in the card table scene to light the people's faces. Notice how it makes a very defined edge along Daniel's forehead, and also it makes very sharp shadows underneath Elaine's chin. Those can be exploited to great effect in situations like that, where it actually calls for hard shadows. Here's the 13 watt fluorescent bulb in the exact same situation. You can notice it has a little bit more of a greenish tint to it, which actually serves the situation a little bit, but it also has no hard shadows at all. So if you didn't want to make hard shadows, you could use that bulb instead. Let's talk about some of the other accessories that we used in the tabletop setups. I bought 8 of these metal-based alligator clips for about $10 from a local store. You can find them at most bookstores, and they're really great for actually holding these miniature flags that we were using throughout the setup. These flags are fantastic because they're black on one side and white on the other, so they can either be used for negative fill or positive fill depending on what you're using for that situation. They're cut from large pieces of cardboard backing that's used for mounting photographs. Here we're using 2 clips to mount a larger flag. And as soon as you turn it around, it becomes a reflector, or you can use it for making reflective lines in the surfaces as we discussed in one of the setups. You can also use the clips to mount the flag directly to the countertop. This is useful when you want the reflective line or the negative fill line to start directly from the countertop. Next thing I'm showing you is a kit for converting a standard AA mag light to an LED light instead. The bulb on the left hand side is the standard xenon bulb that comes with the mag light. The LED cluster on the right hand side can be purchased for about $10 and it converts a $5 mag light into a powerful LED light. Total cost is about $15 and you get a much more powerful LED light that uses standard AA batteries and it's very rugged. It also comes with a push button switch on the back, which makes it real easy so you don't have to twist the head every single time to turn it on and off. You can also buy this flashlight mounting device for about $5, which allows you to lock in the flashlight into any position that you need and make just the right light. You can also add gels by the use of some gaffer's tape. You can use any gel that you like, just cut it into a very small square inch, and then use 2 pieces of gaffer's tape to mount it in place. Another useful LED light is this miniature one for about $10 that comes with its own stand so you can position it any way that you like. And it makes a great rim light. This police flashlight is the Pelican M6 Lithium. It's the same one that we used earlier to make a red light in front of the Zenith Space Command remote control. Because it's powerful at 8 watts and because it has a great reflector, it can push through diffusion and gels and still maintain its brightness and saturation. We used it to great effect earlier in the scene with Arnie and Daniel, and it was really the only flashlight we had that was able to be visible even in that extremely bright situation. Pelican also makes an LED version of the exact same light called the M6 LED. It has a 1 watt Luxeon inside it, so it's 8 times less powerful, but at the same time, it's 40 times more efficient. So if you need a little bit more light, not quite as much as a xenon, you can use the M6 LED. There's a manufacturer that also makes a 3 watt version of this LED light, but at the same time, look at the type of lens that they use on theirs as opposed to Pelican's. Pelican also makes a 3-watt version of their M6 LED. It just uses 3 batteries instead of 2. But what I want to draw your attention to is the quality of the reflector and the quality of the lens that they use in their particular flashlight. Unless you're going for some kind of an effect, most of the time the Pelican flashlight is going to end up being the winner in this case because they use a much higher quality reflector and a much higher quality lens and optics. Now notice how the 3-watt Luxeon emits about a half a stop more light than the 1-watt Luxeon. However, you'll notice on the competitor's flashlight that it has a green fringe around the center spot that the Pelican does not have. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is the 2 Pelican flashlights, the 1-watt Luxeon on the left-hand side and the 8-watt Police Xenon flashlight on the right-hand side. Notice how the Police flashlight is not only yellow, but it's also about 2 stops brighter, whereas the 1-watt Luxeon is blue, which is daylight, and it's also about 2 stops less bright. Now the reason for that, of course, is that LEDs are daylight balanced in this particular case, whereas the Xenon is going to be about 3200 degrees Kelvin. So you can see the different uses for those. However, don't forget that the 1-watt Luxeon is 40 times more efficient. It'll last about 40 hours on 2 batteries, as opposed to the Xenon, which will last only about an hour on 2 sets of batteries. You can buy either one of these flashlights for under $50. They're very affordable, and also the sets of batteries replacements are $25 for the rechargeable ones. They'll last about an hour for the Xenon and about 40 hours for the LED. Well, that's all she wrote for the tabletop setups. Thank you very much for watching the last 27 minutes. I hope it was fun for you. It was definitely fun for me making it for you guys. I hope this will help you make insert scenes for movies, or insert scenes for product videos, or instructional videos, or even to help you sell stuff on eBay and make it look really nice. Whatever you use it for, I hope you the best of luck.